All right, welcome everyone to, we don't even know, fourth or fifth of the local supporting local business panels. We are really excited. We have Shima here from Sharp Tadab, Employment Law. I don't think that you ever thought, Shima, that employment law would start getting exciting and people wanting to know all of this, right?
It's been an interesting few weeks.
Yeah, I bet it was, and I can't wait to hear a bit more about it. And when we also have Becky here from the Director of HR, I had to actually look this up, Director of HR and Operations for the Waipuna Hospice. So you've had your share of HR and worries and people as well, right? Because not only are we in lockdown, but you also have a lot of essential workers. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, yeah, it's been a really interesting time for the team. Lots of changes that happened almost overnight.
Yes.
And mobilising a workforce within about 48 hours.
Well, that's a mission. So I'm really excited to hearing a little bit about this as well. So welcome, ladies. Thank you so much for joining our panel with Tony and Valerie as well. We do this once a week just to support our local community and our local businesses in making sure that they get the latest and the greatest. And I think we've gone now into the stage where people are ready to go back into, next week. Hopefully we'll reopen or some of the businesses reopen in level 3. And people are starting to get really worried. I mean, I'm pretty sure, Shima, and I'll hope you share this with us shortly, but it's gone from like total chaos of what am I going to do to really people now thinking, okay, can I actually afford this? And how is my future going to look like? And how am I going to structure my business to make it work? On the other hand, I'm sure, Becky, you've seen the opposite where you're going to say, how do you mobilize a whole new workforce? So you've got the opposite problem, I would say, to most of the businesses. So it'd be really nice to know a little bit, and I'll start with you, Shima. How have the last couple of weeks been for you? What do you see? What trends do you see?
Yeah, interesting. So, 48 hours notice and the world changed. The government opening up the wage subsidy to all businesses was a real game changer. I'd been having a sort of steady stream of inquiries from businesses about accessing the wage subsidy. That was when it was very restrictive. That was when you had to be able to submit financials to show a 30% drop in revenue. And then it just got opened up and suddenly everybody was applying, but nobody quite knew what it meant in terms of, we had the Prime Minister saying our expectation is that people will use best efforts to pay 80% of people's wages. But I think with that, there was a clear understanding and acceptance that not every business would be able to pay 80% of wages all the time. And then, we've seen the subsidy scheme getting progressively tightened up to the point where that change was made on the 27th of March, where if you applied after 4 o'clock, you had to keep people on for the 12 weeks that you received the subsidy for, which was quite a big change. So lots of conversations now around, we've sort of almost moved past the wage subsidy, lots of queries about leave, getting people to take leave, and I can cover that if people are interested. But I think now people are starting to look post-lockdown, what will that look like? What is the shape of their business going to be? And how do they keep themselves alive in the next 6 and 12 months?
Yes, big one, right? Because we've seen a couple of really big businesses go into liquidation. We can argue the story about was it due to COVID-19, yes or not, another day, but we've seen, Burger King going into receivership, Bauer Media, so they're really big businesses. Air New Zealand has already announced that they're going to make 3,500 people redundant, which is going to be even a more logistical nightmare. But if you had any advice to people, because now is the situation or the moment of impulse reactions, right? People, and it's a natural behavior. We're in a panic, we have fear, so we go, oh, I need to make stuff redundant. So if you had any advice to give to those people who are feeling that stress, what would that be?
What I'm saying to employers in terms of paying staff is pay as much as you can for as long as you can. I think there's a whole spectrum of advice out there, and if anyone's spent any length of time in chat rooms and various forums, it's everything from the people that say you've got an employment agreement, you must pay 100% of the time, to accountants who I know have taken a very hard line saying, absolutely do not use up your cash reserves. That is totally imprudent behaviour as a business owner. You pay people what you can afford to pay people, and if that's $5.85 a week on the subsidy, then that's all you should pay. And I think it was interesting that we saw last week the change in provisions under the Companies Act, because I was saying to directors of companies, look, you can't afford to go into debt to pay your staff. You cannot use up all your cash reserves, because actually you're trading while insolvent, and that's a breach of your duties under the Companies Act as a director. So then you have the government bringing in these sort of safe harbour provisions around directors trading. So I've almost been in a situation where I have a conversation with somebody in the morning, and at about this time of the afternoon, I feel like I need to ring them back and say, that conversation we had, chuck that out the window, let's start again, because the world has changed again. But I think this is a time for communicating with your staff. I think if there's one thing I would emphasise, it's talk to your staff, keep them appraised, keep them up to date. You might not be able to pay them. If you can pay them this week, tell them what you're going to pay them. Tell them you'll talk to them next week about what you can do next week. The world is a very uncertain place, and I think that communication aspect is something that hopefully as an employer will stand you in good stead. If you can say, look, as much as we could, we told our staff what we had going on, we kept them in the loop, because I think that then helps further down the track when you have to have conversations around reducing pay or reducing hours or possibly restructuring. At least you've told people and been upfront about what is happening and what might happen. I think the employers who've just sort of shut down communications are the ones that are going to get a lot of pushback from staff.
So you've raised a good question, because the first natural reaction we all have is I need to restructure, I need to make people redundant, right? Or I need to close the doors and my staff will be out of a job. You've raised a couple of points before, and I would love you to reiterate what alternatives do people have if they're really thinking about having to restructure and make people redundant.
So the law says that before you dismiss any employee, and obviously a redundancy is a dismissal, you've got to look at all alternatives. So, and certainly as part of this, an employer will be expected to have talked to their landlord about their rent, talked to their bank about their financial situation, gone through their budget line by line and looked where they can make savings. I did have someone send me something that says, oh, we've stopped Friday night drinks. I was like, I think you're going to have to do better than that before you make people redundant, given that nobody's having Friday night drinks these days. Fruit box and Friday night drinks were the two items that identified so they could make savings on. So, really genuinely chunky stuff. I think then you've got to look at other stuff like genuinely, can you get agreement with staff to take leave? Because leave is obviously a debt on your books. You owe that to your staff. If you can't do it by agreement, then you've got the option of giving people notice to take leave under the Holidays Act. So you're looking at all the ways of managing your cash flow. These comments the government's made now about deferring provisional tax. Again, that's something you would look at. So you'd look at everything else you can do short of making redundancies. Now, you might do all of that and still need to make redundancies, but at least you've done your due diligence. And if you ever get challenged, and this is always going to be the situation, the 0800 I've been sacks of this world are going to be crawling through these redundancies and saying, well, what did you do to make savings? So, and that communication with staff piece. Are people happy to cut hours? Are people happy to cut pay? Even if it's only on a temporary basis, I think all of that needs to be explored. And then as a last option, you would look for voluntary redundancies before you did mandatory ones.
Just to reiterate, Shima, that to make somebody redundant is going to cost you the same as paying them out through the subsidy anyway. So that should be, I'm quite surprised that some businesses are doing that as a first call in terms of restructuring.
When you say pay them out for the period, I mean, what if I was being really cunning about this and saying, you know, if I had a client coming to me and saying, well, what's the time frame? I applied for the subsidy post 27 March. So I've got to keep this person on my books for the 12-week period. You could start your redundancy consultation now, and you could work through that, and you could give them, say they had a 4-week notice period, you could give them 4 weeks notice at week 8, which would take them through to week 12. The other option I know of some employers doing is they are doing a redundancy process now. They are effectively giving notice of termination earlier, paying the contractual notice period, but then saying, because we have given an undertaking to the government to not to make any redundancies during the period for which we've received the subsidy, you'll remain on our books and we will keep paying you the subsidy for that 12-week period. So that's not a cost to the employer, no. They're just passing on the subsidy.
No. So, and let's say business is completely gone. You know, there are some tourism, some hospitality businesses that are probably not coming back, unfortunately. You know, and let's say they have a number of staff. What is the process that they need to go through? You know, and obviously communication and making sure, is it, you know, there'll be probably some terms in their employment agreement about non-continuation of business operations, but what's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so as far as usual, it's your normal process. So this is the proposal. Now, when you're talking about a complete shutdown, obviously you're not talking about selection criteria in terms of which roles are being selected for redundancy. Are there any redeployment options? You're saying, we're done. The doors are closed and they're not reopening. But we still do the dance. We say this is a proposal and we won't make any decisions until after we've consulted with you, as we all sort of think, come on, who are we fooling here? But that's what the law tells us we need to do. So we do that. Now, the other thing I think we need to be super careful about in all of this is those consultation meetings, phone calls, whatever they are. Obviously, they can't be face-to-face. A lot of them will be getting done just like this with a Zoom meeting. So it's also about making sure that the employee that you're consulting with has their support person or representative there. So setting up a Zoom meeting so that their lawyer or advocate or whomever can dial in and participate in that meeting. And in the same way as you would for any face-to-face meeting, if the employee turns up on their own and you say, well, hang on, this is a meeting about your ongoing employment. You are entitled to have a support person or representative. You've come on your own. Are you happy for the meeting to proceed? You get that confirmation from them before you start. If not, you adjourn the meeting, give them that time. So, and I think what I would hate to have happen is a situation where an employer does everything right in the sense of advising the employee of their entitlements to seek advice and representation. The employee turns up to a meeting, the employer doesn't take that step of double checking, and then the employee challenges the decision and says, well, I was so stressed, I didn't have time, I didn't know, I didn't understand, and you never checked with me and gave me that chance, you know. So I think be very careful about that. And I think also think about your time frames. This might be a time to be a little bit more forgiving about time frames. I mean, believe me, employers, lawyers and advocates, we're all still working. I've got a mediation tomorrow. We're pumping settlements through MB. It's business as usual. But, you know, in terms of people getting hold of somebody and getting that representation, you might just, you know, need to be a bit accommodating with time. But it's still that process, proposal, opportunity to seek clarification and to provide feedback. The employer then considers it and makes a decision. So,
and that's
for you, like a technical question here. You said, you know, like the double checking and that the employer could be doing everything right and it could still bite them in the butt because they didn't check or whatever. Now with the tools at hand and doing something like this over Zoom, is it recommended to record those meetings for later on? Like, you know, like we're doing right now, we have a recording of this. Would it be worthwhile to go and say, okay, for this meeting, I will be recording it. Are you okay with it? And then
Yeah, personally, I'm not a fan of recording meetings. You will always say something you regret later as an employer, but as an employee too. Some people like to record everything. Some people see it as quite a threatening tactic. They slam their phone down on the table and say, "I'm recording this meeting," and I say, "Okay, doesn't bother me." I don't think it's necessarily best practice. You've got to have some record of the meeting. But for me, the purpose of that record is to record the important points of discussion, not to record, has everybody been to the toilet before we start? Does anyone need a drink of water? That's...
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So just again, in this current environment, Shima, and you can probably back this up, Becky, getting you involved, is around working from home policies or remote working policies. How does that
policies? Who has a policy?
I know. That's kind of going to answer my question about
the IT companies.
Should you have one? Well, we have policies up the wazoo, but in terms of human resources, working from home, there's health and safety policies, there's this policy, blah, blah, blah. So should companies actually have a remote working or a working from home policy? If they haven't had one in the past, would they need one now? What does that look like?
Yeah, and
should it cover the processes and procedures about time sheeting, work environment, etc., etc.?
Yeah.
And then I'll get you to ask that, Shima, and then Becky, what have you guys done?
Yeah, I was going to say Becky's probably the one to answer that. I mean, look, I think the reality is everybody's playing catch up here. I think if you're talking to HR professionals, they have got so much stuff on their plate that, quite frankly, the last thing on their minds is a remote working policy. And I think it's going to depend on the business. I mean, for example, for us, we've made sure, as far as we can, as far as I'm aware, that everything is absolutely secure, because this is very sensitive, confidential client information. We cannot have it. So people aren't using personal devices. They're not logging on over public Wi-Fi, things like that. I think from a health and safety perspective, again, we're all doing this on the fly. And a policy doesn't help. A policy is nice to have, but I think actually it's that checking in with people. How's your workstation set up? Do you need help? Are you feeling comfortable? Are you feeling discomfort? Can we work on something together?
I guess just in terms of those policies, would they kind of get the management team's mindset into, actually our policy says we must do remote check-ins, we must do this, we must do that. So it's just some thought. Becky, what have you guys done at the hospice with your how many employees and volunteers have you had to kind of maneuver around?
Yeah, so we've got 145 paid staff and another 750 odd volunteers.
Wow.
The thing was that probably 90% of those are over 70, so we pretty quickly lost a huge portion of our workforce. And being volunteers, it was quite challenging in terms of we had the same employment responsibilities without the fact that we don't pay the people, but we needed to make sure that they were okay. So we've replicated all of our processes for our employees. We do exactly the same for our volunteer team as well. In terms of the working from home, we had a policy, and that was pretty hastily reviewed by a couple of our team. And that's sort of become more like a checklist for managers who haven't necessarily had people working from home before. So they're sort of using that policy as a guide to go through with people. Okay, this is a new opportunity for you to work from home. How is your workstation set up? How often do you want me to be contacting you? What's your access like at home? And sort of using that policy as a guide, really, of good practice. So that's how we've approached it.
So you said you lost like a lot of your workforce, right? So, I mean, most of them over 70. How did you guys cope from a team perspective around losing so much of your workforce?
Yeah, good question. We're still continuing to adapt, really. We have both a clinical essential service. We had an inpatient unit and a huge community nursing team. And we also had 7 retail sites. So we run secondhand shops as well. When we hit level 2, the decision was made that when we got to level 4, we'd actually close our inpatient unit. So it was pretty challenging for the team. And as well as that, overnight hours who used to visit patients in their homes had to start learning how to use Zoom, sharpening up some of their IT skills, having one-on-one meetings, and we put a huge amount of effort into training caregivers on how to look after someone when we can't do it because we can't be in the home. So our volunteers used to play a big part of that. And ultimately they couldn't. A lot chose not to. Some wanted to continue. But I think the big thing was communicating, not only with our team who were on site, but finding other ways of talking to people, daily notices that go out, trying to include some of the wellness information that's available, and there's so much information out there. So we're seeing some really great tools, really great ideas developed from our team about how to stay engaged. We do a stuff quiz with our volunteers who want to remote in, and we do it with our paid staff as well, just to kind of keep people engaged. And that communication, especially with the volunteers, continues just once a week at this stage. But every single volunteer received a phone call just to check in on them, which they really appreciated.
Becky, can I ask you a question around employment? So what would be the most asked question from your employees to you, and how would you deal with those questions?
Sure. So we've had quite a mixed bag. We've got a lot of non-clinical staff and our retail staff who were immediately affected by the closing of our retail shops. The question from them has been, am I still going to get paid? And once we were able to answer that yes, they were, the next question was, how soon can we go back to work? So we've got people sitting at home, not being able to access a huge amount, not being able to do a huge amount, but they just itching to get back to work. So we're getting hundreds of questions from these staff members who just want to be doing something to help. And I think that's been really challenging. So that's been the biggest question from our retail staff. And then from our clinical staff, it's been around, how are we going to do this? Because the service that we provide is so hands-on that it's meant huge changes to the team about how they do things. So the role always had quite a big education component, and now it's taken that to a whole new level, where we're working a lot more with families, providing them a lot more written or electronic information about how to care for someone. So, yeah.
Sounds like the communication level has to be increased, and a lot of information has to just be channeled by the management team down to the people, because there's a lot of uncertainty around, and basically what we're saying is give people as much as possible. As soon as you know something, give them the information, clear all this ambiguity and questions in their mind. It's lovely. Thank you, Becky.
So Becky, one question I have, and I think a lot of us will have the same question. When we go back to level 3, our world is not going back to normal, right? So a lot of us will be able to reopen, but in fairness, even the changes of how we operate will be huge. You've been through those changes, yeah, because you had to adopt those changes with the parts which are still open. How did you guys deal with those, and what are like practical tips you could potentially give business owners around, steps they could take to make this easier in level 3?
Yep. We did. The service changed, some of it gradually and some of it really rapidly. And I think probably one of the best tips I could say is keep a bit of a spreadsheet of the stuff that you've changed. Whether it's as simple as changing your security processes or your rubbish collections, keep a list of all of those things, because at some stage you're going to have to revert back to either what you had or something new again. So we've sort of kept a spreadsheet of what something was before and what we've changed it to. And if we've had to continually make refinements to that, we've just sort of updated the spreadsheet. And that's going to be our reopening check sheet as well, that we make sure we haven't missed anything off.
So you're talking about we. Who in your team is we? Is it the whole team? Is it management? Who did all those changes and made those decisions?
Sure. So we implemented a pandemic planning team, our PPT, and there is about 7 people as part of that team. Quite a few of our senior leadership team, and then a few other team members as well. Some of those are administrators, some operational, some are clinical, and each person has been put into an area which is maybe welfare, operations, logistics. It didn't really matter what your role was before COVID, but you got a new role as part of the pandemic planning team. So it just means that you can actually focus on one specific area and know that you've got trust in your colleagues to do the rest of it. So the we includes 2 or 3 people on every sort of topic, whether that's operationally or whether it's logistics or planning.
I love the title. Like,
Yeah.
that's like so cool. PPT. I think I'm going to claim this, and that's really awesome. All right, guys. We will open it up. Like, there's a lot of questions. I'm sure Valerie and Tony have a couple more. But if you guys want to ask any specific example questions to you and what you're going through, either unmute yourself and share it with us, or put it into the Zoom chat so that we can really make sure that we answer all your questions.
I'll kick one off, just taking on from what Becky was saying there and my previous question around you made some changes to some people's roles right now, obviously temporary. As businesses come out, and I'm actually getting sick of the word pivoting. I know you love it, Paulina, but there's a lot of messaging out there about pivoting. How about alignment? Or there are some businesses, especially retail or even training services that may be changing. So roles might be changing. So in terms of your job description, your role specification, what you're initially employed to do is going to be changing. So Shima, is there should we as an employers be looking at, well, actually your role is changing, this is a new role description, it's a new, not necessarily, is it a new employment agreement, is it new, what's the process behind that?
Yeah, good question. And I suspect if anyone looked at, anyone who's been with an employer for any length of time, looked at the job description when they first started, a few years on, it doesn't take long for you to go, actually, that's not what I do at all. I mean, yes, absolutely. Best practice would be to document that with your staff, to sit down and say, look, you're no longer a retail shop assistant, you're some sort of online shop assistant, and you're picking from a warehouse and you're packing and shipping, or you're something different. Absolutely. If this is going to be a permanent change to somebody's role, best practice is that you document that, agree it with them, and yeah, it doesn't need to be a whole new employment agreement, but it would go on their personnel file. I suspect a lot of employers probably won't rush to do that, because I think we're all going to feel our way through what the new normal looks like, and I wouldn't want to be too quick to sort of lock things down, because don't forget that every job description should have that line somewhere, either at the beginning or the end, that says, and any other duty that the employer reasonably directs you to perform. So, yes, you're absolutely right. Jobs will change, and we will need to be careful around documenting those, but I wouldn't necessarily rush to do that, because it's going to take a bit of time, I think, for the dust to settle and people to figure out just what it is that they do. And of course, what you might do as part of that, restructure is a bit of a dirty word at this point, but it might mean that you do realign some things within your business. You do look at reporting lines, you do look at remuneration as part of that. So again, I wouldn't rush to do it, because it might be part of a bigger sort of strategic review of actually just what is the shape of our business now. And we don't want to be the Kodak that just slowly goes out of business.
What about secondment letters or amendment letters? Are they still a thing these days?
So secondment's quite a specific situation, and I am aware, for example, where we've got some clients who are closed and have no work for their staff, but have been in touch with kiwi fruit pack houses and have said, look, we've got a bunch of employees, they're available to work, could we second them to you? And that is a very specific arrangement where an employee goes and works remains employed by the original employer, but goes and works for a period of time for a different employer for a specific reason and for a specific period. So yes, you would definitely document that and record the arrangement, not least because between the two employers, you want to document who's paying who and how much. Variation letters, yep, definitely. I mean, that's where there's a variation of the employment agreement. So, you know, again, be thoughtful about at what point do you want to lock in a change to somebody's terms and conditions of employment, as opposed to saying, hey, look, we need everybody to be a bit flexible around what we're doing and how we're doing it at the moment.
At what point would you then go and say, if you're saying hold off for a little while, at what point would you go and say,
yeah, I can't
now
tell
we
you
need to make
that. I mean, look, that's really going to depend on every business, and it's going to depend. I mean, we still don't really know what level 3 looks like, how long that's going to be. You know, I would have thought, and for some businesses, you know, even level 2 is going to make a fundamental change to the way they do business. If you're a venues company or you know, something like that, you know, level 2 is not much different to level 4 really in some ways. So it's going to depend. It's the wording the courts always use when they're weaseling out of it is it's a matter of fact and degree in every situation, and that's literally what it is. It's going to depend on your particular circumstances.
Shima, can I ask you a question around if somebody really truly thinking that they're exiting the market once they're able to? So can you just kind of give us the procedures so we're clear on what to do with the employees in the way of employment law?
So you're talking about a complete shutdown and wind up of a business?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So it's develop the proposal. Step 1 is always develop your proposal and your business plan to support that, because that is absolutely open for scrutiny by an employee. So this is the proposal. We are planning to shut down, and the reasons are You know, this is our financial situation. This is our cash flow. This is our P&L. This is our balance sheet. This is why we cannot reopen our doors at the end of lockdown.
So you release quite a lot of information to the employee.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. And you're expected to, and you're required to. And if you don't, believe me, the employment court will say, well, you open your books to us and we'll have a look instead. That's a big change in employment law in recent years. It didn't used to be that way, but now expect to share those financial details. You know, and you would wrap the appropriate confidentiality stuff around that, in the sense that you would say this is commercially sensitive information. We require you to keep it in confidence. You can share it for the purpose of seeking advice, but not beyond that. I mean, the reality is if you're shutting, people are going to know you're shutting. So it's not like there's a competitive advantage for other people in that. So then you write to the employees with your proposal and with that supporting information. You know, at the moment, if everyone's closed, you're probably doing that by email. I would give people a call and say, look, I'm about to send you an email. We're making a proposal to close the business. Have a read of it. I know you'll have a lot of questions, so you don't want them to start peppering you with questions immediately. Have a read of it, have a think about it, and then come back to me. Give them a few days to think about it, and there may be questions and clarification during that time. And that's quite a valuable dialogue, I think, for understanding. Along with that initial piece of information, I think the redundancies and restructures that I think I've seen go really well has been where the employer has explained the story of the journey they've been on and where they're going. Now, where they're going might be a complete shut, but explain that. Once employees understand the why of something, I think it's not a cure-all, but it helps. You know, people understand if they feel like they're being given the mushroom treatment, you know, dropped in it and left in the dark, that's when they're going to push back. So share that information, share that explanation, try and get that dialogue around. If you've got questions, clarification, come back to me. Then you have a formal meeting with them. And that's the meeting where they can have a support person or representative with them. And that's for them to give their feedback. I had a classic situation where I had a client who shut down his business and just told his employees, we're shutting it next Friday, and here's your 2 weeks notice. And I said, but you've got a consultant. He goes, well, why? I'm shutting my business. And I said, well, what if one of them wanted to take over your business? And he said, well, none of them are smart enough to be able to do that. I said, well, but that's their risk and their business decision, not necessarily yours. So that's why even with a complete shutdown, you've still got to go through that consultation process, because you never know. Look, I'd be shocked if anyone came up with some amazing, brilliant idea or a ton of funding to keep your business going. But you've got to follow the process. So have that consultation meeting. As I said to Tony before, you're not getting into discussions about which roles are being selected or are there any redeployment options, so all of that disappears out of your process. Then you've got to carefully consider the feedback. Are there other things you could do? Have the employees raised anything new? You know, have they said, well, do you need the premises? You could surrender your lease, you could run this online, you could do something different. So carefully consider all of that and then make your decision. So it's, for a complete shutdown, it's a fairly short process. Well, short in terms of there's a few steps cut out, but it's still really important that you give people time to ask questions and clarification, then genuinely give them an opportunity to provide their feedback and consider that feedback before delivering a decision. So, you know, you're looking at realistically a couple of weeks.
So, Shima, what about if someone is facing liquidation? Is the process still the same?
Yeah, liquidation's different because liquidators have specific powers under the Companies Act and they will deal with your staff for you. So don't worry about it. If you're going into liquidation, the liquidator will deal with it. And they can't be sued. So you're actually best not to do anything and leave it to the liquidator. And then there's provisions around, I can't think, it's Schedule H of the Companies Act that deals with the preference of payments and wage and holiday payments.
What about receivership? How does that differ?
Same thing. So the receivers again have powers. So again, if you think you're on the brink of liquidation or receivership, to be honest, I probably wouldn't bother starting some sort of a restructuring or redundancy process. Leave it to the people that have got immunity.
I think it's really important. You just raised a subject for the people who might either be employees here or who might be watching this later who are employees. Under the act you just shared, and don't quote me on the number, you've just shared it, there is preferential treatment to staff in their payouts. So the order, which I found out recently, is very fascinating. So once all your assets, everything is sold, they go for liquidators, then staff, then IRD, and then secured creditors.
No, staff. Yeah. And the thing is that wages are only guaranteed up to a certain level. So where people have missed out is where they've had big holiday, annual leave balances, and they haven't necessarily got all of that.
Yes.
Staff are not; they don't rank that highly, and it's pretty typical that staff don't actually get paid very much at all.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow, I did not know that, because
it's much like business owners, really.
Yeah, well, the business owners don't get paid from day one, right? No, I'm just
kidding. Yeah.
Different
Shareholders
story,
are the
different
ultimate unsecured creditor.
Yes, absolutely. And that's another one. If you are a director and an employee, you are not part of the secured staff. So you go even lower on the bottom, because as a director, you're not secured under the Act.
No, directors' fees aren't preferential payment, no.
Yes. All right. So any other questions right now? I had one and it skipped my mind, so I'm just going to ask someone else.
Well, I have a question, and it's probably very similar in the way of, if, say, for example, you're selling the business, and I guess there will be the same process prior to, but I think there's a bit of uncertainty, or people not sure what happens in the way of, is it correctly that I understand that you have to actually basically cease your contract with your employees on your last day of operation, and the new owner of the business re-employs them on the day one? Is that how it works?
Well, the answer is it depends.
Right.
It depends what's in your sale and purchase agreement.
Right.
So some sale and purchase agreements agree that employees will transfer on the same terms and conditions and transfer all of their accrued entitlements across. And obviously then there's a provision, there's an apportionment made for that against the purchase price. More typically as a situation where the vendor agrees that they will terminate all employees on the settlement date, but that the purchaser will offer employment to some or all employees on whatever terms they see fit. The thing for a vendor in that situation is to check your employment agreements. Every employment agreement should have, must have by law, what's known as an employee protection provision. And that's a provision that has the mechanics of what will happen in the event that the business is sold. And so there will be some there should be, it's been properly drafted, there should be some quite specific things in there about if the business is to be sold, the employer will negotiate with the new employer about whether they will take the staff on, and if so, on what terms. And some of them are very prescriptive. So that's not a clause that says the purchaser, it doesn't usually, some of them do. I've seen some interesting ones over the years. But usually it's about a process for negotiating with the incoming employer. It doesn't say what has to happen, it shouldn't. But if you're selling your business, check your employment agreements, because believe me, it is a really awkward situation for an employer to be in. They're already counting the money that they're going to get from the sale of the business, and they have this moment where they realise they've completely forgotten about their staff. They haven't thought about notice periods. They haven't done any redundancy consultation. They're less than a week out from the sale going through. I'm not kidding. And they're suddenly going, do we have to give them notice? Do we have to consult with them? Do we have to pay them? And a really common one is, but they're getting a job with the incoming employer, so do I still have to pay them notice? And the answer to that, of course, is yes, because contractually you've promised you'll do that. And actually the question you should have asked was, 6 or 8 weeks ago, what are my obligations to my staff? It's
that might be a little bit
common.
tricky now, Bo, right? Like with COVID-19, that they would have not thought about it 3 weeks ago, because 3 weeks ago they weren't facing this, right? So
yeah, but you are talking about, if you're talking about selling a business, so this is not a receivership or a liquidation, this is a sale of a business. So there must be some sort of negotiation period where you've got a sale and purchase agreement and you're thinking about, it might be quite short. This might be a distressed business. People might be picking it up quite quickly. Look, you do what you can with the time you've got. But, what I'm saying is somewhere very early on in that piece, you need to be looking at your employment agreements.
I think, Becky, you've done this in the last couple of weeks, and quite rapid succession. What's been your biggest challenge and your biggest learning in trying to do all this kind of stuff?
That's a good question.
Put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, good question. I think for the parts of the business where we've had to shut down, our biggest learning has been how many questions people will have about how that impacts them. And I think the biggest thing people want is to know what it means for them and how long it's going to go on for, which is, the $1 million question at this stage. So just being able to give them as much certainty as we can. And the thing we've probably struggled a little bit with is the fluidity of some of our decisions. So we've made a decision today, but actually tomorrow that decision needs to change because we've got new information or the situation's changed. So the rapidness in which we've needed to communicate to our teams has been the biggest challenge. And we had a number of staff who didn't even access email as part of their daily routines. So now saying to them, look, you have to check your emails every day, getting their personal email and their work email, because we have a huge part-time workforce, and making sure that we're communicating to both email addresses that we have on file for them. We do have a couple of people who don't have email addresses, so we've got a phone a friend system in place for them. So it's more just the biggest challenge has been around impact on people, the speed at which they want information, but we haven't necessarily had all the answers. And that's been tough.
So Becky, and probably Shima, but I'll go to Becky. Question, I want to turn around this conversation just for a little bit around, we've talked about all the things business owners and employers should do. What did you see which was great from your employees, or what can employees do to support the employer at this point? Because I mean, it's a two-way street, right? I know most people don't see it this way, but I think it's a give and take between employer and employees. So what can employees do, or what have you seen employees do which made your life better and easier?
Sure. So one of the things we actually undertook before level 2 hit us was a staff survey, just a really brief survey that we put out to people to say, hey, tell us a bit about what your home situation's like. If you had to work from home, could you? So we made a genuine expression of interest to them of what could they do? Would they have capacity to work extra hours? What was, did they have anyone over 70 living with them? So just some basic questions. And from that, we added any other comments or what's your biggest concern? And we got some amazing things from that in terms of how often some of them wanted to be communicated with. Some nominated that to be daily, others said weekly, others said what you're doing now is fine. So it was really valuable for us to get some feedback from them. And we had a huge number of people offering for redeployment. So if they worked in a non-clinical area, say in one of our shops that we were closing, we actually managed to redeploy a couple of staff to help drive equipment delivery vehicles, for example. So they were the ones coming up with these fantastic ideas about what other skills they had that we could utilize in some way. So I think, yeah, absolutely, it's two-way. The employees we have, everyone wants to help. Everyone wants to do their part. They know that this is a crazy situation. So don't be shy to ask the questions.
Awesome. What about you, Shima? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, it's interesting. Becky and I were involved in a session last week with a bunch of HR managers in Tauranga in the Bay of Plenty, and we were talking about tips and tricks that people had for effective team working and keeping teams together. A lot of them seem to focus around Friday night drinks, interestingly enough.
The New Zealand culture right here.
It is. But
that's how HR people get through it all, isn't it?
Yeah, and lawyers too. But I think it's that sense of social connection. I think that's really important, maintaining that. A whole bunch of other stuff might be crazy around us, but maintaining that sense of connection with your colleagues and co-workers, with your wider team, I think that's been really important. And people, it sounds like people have actually been doing some really cool stuff. We've in our firm we've got PAs. Which has been converted into pet assistants, and this is like the early days of the internet. Everyone's just sharing terrible photos of their pets doing stupid stuff. But it's the sort of thing that actually you think, instead of opening your email and going, oh, what have I got today, there's some cheerful stuff in your inbox. It's silly but true. It's the little things, I think.
Shima, can I ask you a question around, it's a bit on a serious note. So say, for example, you are an employee and you're getting absolutely shafted by your employer. So they're really mistreating you, and you feel at least that you've been mistreated. And I think it will probably apply to those hospitality, younger people who work in restaurants, and they don't quite know their rights, and they don't really know what's right, what's wrong. Maybe some of them new to New Zealand or whatever they might be. So what do employees have, or where can they go? Is there a helpline, or just a general overview, I guess, what to do if something like that happens to?
Definitely. And look, I think there's a range of things there. I think I've heard some awful stories about employers, for example, collecting the wage subsidy, but then not passing it on to their staff. But then equally, I've had queries from people saying, I'm only getting paid $5.85 a week. Doesn't my employer have to pay me 80%? And the answer to that, by the way, is, well, if they can't afford to pay you 80%, then they'll pay you whatever they can. There is a lot of information online, and I really encourage employers and employees to look on there. The employment.govt.nz website is really good. That's got really useful information, for example, for people who are concerned around what employers are doing with annual leave and sick leave and things like that. There's lots of information there about how the wage subsidy works. I think there's been a huge amount of misunderstanding that employees apply for it. No, it's employers, it's a subsidy. So it's money that the employer can use through its payroll system to pay staff. There's been a misunderstanding, a lot of misunderstanding, I think, around the top up and the level of that. So I think information's really important. So I would start with employment.govt.nz. Also the COVID website, there's lots of links between the two of them. There was also a really interesting Q&A on the Radio New Zealand website on the 4th of April. There was a whole lot of questions on there around from employers and employees. What about this? What if that? Can I be required to do this? What if I need someone to do that? So I think there's a lot of good resources out there. I would be cautious around encouraging, there's a lot of blogs, there's a lot of legal articles, there's a lot of stuff out there. I would treat some of that with a bit of caution, you know, depending on where people sit, quite frankly, on the political spectrum will affect the way they view things. And there might be some advice that it expresses a view, and that view, look, to be perfectly frank, all of us, we're expressing a view on what we think the law is going to be until such time as we get a decision from the employment court telling us we were either right or wrong about it. That's all it is, because this is untested ground. There is no law to deal with this. So I think start with the government websites, because at least you're getting a neutral view on things.
I think also, and we are about to wrap up shortly anyway, but one thing I want to add to this, not just for employees, but also employers or business owners. And I shared the story just before we went live. So I've helped restructuring businesses and make people redundant in multiple, lots of different businesses. And it's always been fine, because I didn't know the businesses, or all the individual staff personally. I just knew the scenario. You know, it's really easy to make adjustments on job descriptions rather than people. But when I had to restructure my own team, I had to go to an employment lawyer, because I was like, I know the whole structure and I know exactly what I need to do, the steps to take. But I also thinking about, this person just broke up with his girlfriend, and this person is about to buy a house, and this person is doing this. And I got really emotional about not wanting to let go of those people, because good business owners do not want to let go of people. It's not that they are just going, oh, for the fun of it, I'm going to restructure, or I'm going to close the doors. Like they are feeling it as well. And I was hurting. And when I got someone in, and our staff were amazing. They reacted so amazingly that made me even more feel guilty and frustrated and upset, because, you know, like they were also understanding. I'm like, I just have to let you go, and you're being so understanding. I don't understand. So my point to this is really make sure that when you're going down this process, I know that money is tight, but that you get a professional in to help you with it. Either if it's Shima, or if you have an HR consultant or a business consultant, someone who's been through this process many times, who knows what to do, and help you take off that emotional burden. Because when you're emotional, you say things you probably shouldn't as a business owner.
Which is why you don't record meetings.
Exactly. So back to that.
Yeah. But genuinely, look, I have been amazed by how employers are looking after their staff. They are maintaining their pay. They don't want to lose people. They've had such a tough time recruiting and retaining great staff for so long. People haven't made that investment lightly, and they don't want to see it walk out the door. So, yeah.
Just a quick thing, and maybe the last topic before we have to shoot off, is around performance management right now. And Becky, you've probably had to change potentially some of the metrics, measures, or KPIs, and how do you performance manage people, and how does that stand in terms of a legal perspective if they're not performing or if they're overperforming? You know, how have you guys managed that process? How has it changed? Is it better, worse? You know, and then Shima, obviously, and how do we, if they're non-performing outside of the work time, you know, is it based on utilization in terms of time? If you're service based, is it sales? Is it outcome? You know, so interested in different stories around that. Becky, I'll lead with yourself.
Yeah, it's definitely been a big change for our team, especially our administrative team, who don't have a huge number of KPIs to start with. Their role is supporting others to achieve their KPIs more often than not, and that's been really challenging. What we've done is I've met with individuals online in a weekly one-on-one, and we've sort of started reassessing what is achievable, what is the best task for you to be focusing on right now. That's really different from one person to the next based on what their home situation is like, what their capacity is. We've had a number of roles that have just continued as normal, and we've had a number who, I don't know, for the ground from the sky at the moment. So I think having the conversations individually with each person is really important, and re-establishing what's appropriate and what's not. And to be fair, I had it way off the mark for one person. I thought they were ticking along, doing great things. And then I had this flood of tears, and she said, I just can't do it. It's all too much. And I said, oh, but you're doing so well. Am I putting too much on you? She's like, yes. So just touching in regularly and keeping that communication open is really important.
Thank you. What about you, Shima?
Yeah, it's interesting. We had this conversation on the Law Society's Employment Law Committee, and we were discussing this just the other day. And we all agreed that in terms of actually trying to do a formal performance management process right now, stop. Just stop. This is not business as usual. People are under stress. People are feeling anxious. Everybody's having to do things in a slightly different way. That's not to say it might not resume at some point in the future. And we all agree that, you know, you would be very clear that we are certainly pausing the process for the period of lockdown. It doesn't mean it's going away. It doesn't mean it's over. But how can you really say to somebody who's working at home at their kitchen table with kids in the background, you're not achieving your KPIs and we're looking at issuing you a formal warning for that? You know, that's unrealistic. And I think that would be completely open to challenge, because people would say, well, you know, you're not part of a performance improvement plan is giving people a genuine opportunity to improve. And I question right now whether you would be doing that. So I think if you've started a formal performance process, pause for now. And if you're looking at people and saying you really aren't cutting the mustard right now, cut them some slack for at least the next couple of weeks.
Take some leave, take the liability off the balance sheet.
Yeah, and,
you know.
and that comes back to what Becky was saying. You know what, some people are struggling and genuinely might be happy to take some leave, because it actually is a relief to know I don't even have to log in today. Today is my day off. It gives me some breaks. So yeah.
I've said on these calls a couple of times before, we're in FFT moments, which is F in first times for a number of businesses and a number of people. So that's great.
All right. We will leave it here because we could go on for hours, and I know that there's people have other commitments. Becky,
and it's a riveting subject.
It is. That's what I said. How often do you hear that employment law is a exciting subject for people to listen to, right? It's like only in pandemics is that the case. Yes. Shima and Becky, thank you so much for joining us, giving us the time and all your expertise and knowledge. Becky, I wish you all the best, because you have a mountain to climb, and you're doing an amazing job for all of us, because I mean, the hospice is something which impacts every single one of us, right? And Shima, thank you so much for the expertise and talking so openly. And I don't think I've ever had an employment lawyer talk that openly to just go and say, don't do that or do that. It's like normally it's a, let me write you a letter about this. So thanks for sharing. If anyone who's watching this, or even you guys still have any questions, I will post this video this afternoon in our Facebook group. Feel free to ask the questions, and I'm sure that we can convince Becky and Shima maybe to pop in and have a look if there's any questions for them. Otherwise, we have a Facebook Live coming up on Friday afternoon, which we will post in the Facebook group. It's not a registered one like this, but in the Facebook group, where we are sharing a couple of good stories from businesses who have, your favorite word, Tony, who have pivoted into a different and are being quite successful with it. So we thought we'll share some good news stories as well, not just the hard stuff like we're discussing today. So thank you everyone for who's watching and who's joined us for your time, and we will see you next Wednesday or Friday on the Facebook Live.
Paulina, do you want to talk about next week's one?
Oh, next week. Yeah, next week's Wednesday one. Tony, you need to jump in here. We have some really exciting presenters as well. Tony, share a little bit about what the topic is.
Sure. Next week, we're being optimistic, and hopefully we might be coming out of lockdown, but the bets are on whether that's going to happen. But as we do come out of lockdown, we need to know what the local business community, what the economy is actually doing, what we need to be doing. So we do have Matt, who is the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, joining us, as well as Nigel, the CEO of Priority One. So we've got the two, those kind of divisions that are prolific in the business community coming on and joining us. So please get your questions ready, and they'll be talking about what we need to do, what we need to be aware of, and what they can help to get us back into the new normal.
Perfect. Awesome. We will leave it here. Everyone have a fantastic afternoon, and we will see you in the community. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Paulina. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.